This is a photo I took visiting the British Natural History Museum quite a few years ago. As far as I know, that display is still there. Is that right, Joseph?
I believe so, yeah. I last
Yeah.
visited, it would have been about 6
Mm,
months ago, and that was still there.
yes.
Yeah, nothing much been updated. It's still pretty much in the same condition as when you would have seen it a few years back. So
Yes, yes. Well, this is one of their big feature displays. It's quite close to the front entrance, and one of the first things you see when you go to this display is the sort of the Great Wall of human evolution, with all of these names, this plethora of names of various homos and Australopithecines and things like that, and all of these casts of skulls. And we have some similar casts. Some of these, we don't have this entire collection. Um, Now, I do have to give them credit. When they put these on display, they have showed where the actual finds are and where they have had to interpret um, the gaps, as it were, because you never find entire skulls, and that's important to remember. You never find entire skeletons either. In fact, you rarely find sort of whole bones. They tend to be broken up, and they have to be put together. And so, what they've done with some of these is where they've assumed that these fragments all come from the one skull and there are a lot of gaps, they've shown where the gaps are. Now, that's being honest. And so, if you study this, you can see there are an awful lot of gaps, and there are bits that don't even exist. Like the one at the top there on the left doesn't have any jawbone and doesn't have much in the way of a top either. The one called Homo naledi, they've assembled that from two pieces and filled in the bit in the middle, was on the basis of certain assumptions. However, this is the take home message that most people have of where we came from. Chimpanzee somehow changing step by step into upright human beings. Now, no evolutionist says that we believe that we evolved from the living chimpanzees. They mean an ape-like ancestor. So this is the idea that most people have in their mind from the secular TV or programs these days, or from their own schoolwork. We start with the ape-like ancestor, and then through a whole series of hominid ancestors, we come to archaic human beings until we get to modern human beings, scientific classification Homo sapiens, which means wise man. And there is a lesson to be learnt there if you look at what the Bible says about people who call themselves wise. Calling themselves wise, they became fools. So we need to be very careful there with that classification. It does act as a warning. So keep that in mind. So let's have a look at some of these so-called archaic human beings that we are supposed to have evolved from. And here are a couple that are well known. One is Cro-Magnon and one is Neanderthal. And we have John held up a couple of those skulls that we've got. They are museum quality casts. They're not the originals. The originals are extremely fragile and they're kept in the sort of the backs of museums and very rarely see the light of day because they are very fragile. But they have made these very good scientific models, and you can buy these. All right, Cro-Magnon man. Cro-Magnon is not an official scientific terminology. It just refers to the fact that these skulls were originally found in a large cave. So these are the original cavemen. Now, a normal picture of cavemen is sort of, Ugg the caveman who is sort of brutish idiot and was just slowly turning his grunts into grammar. Not at all very sophisticated at all. However, there's been some interesting study on so-called cavemen, and one of them we've reported in our newsletter. You might like to look this up. It's about caveman art. Now, you've probably seen some of the wonderful pictures of the art that they've found in some of these caves. It's just absolutely brilliant. And so some scientists decided they would do a study of these animals, which are very cleverly depicted on the cave walls, and have a look at how realistically the cavemen have portrayed the actual movement in terms of if you have a moving quadruped, you've got to work out sort of where the legs are in the different cycles within the stride, and it's not easy to do. And so they looked at the cave art and they compared it with a whole lot of pictures from so-called modern Western art, from modern European art. And they came up with this conclusion. And this is the actual title of their study, which they published in this journal, PLOS1, which is an online journal, so you can access this for free. Cavemen were better at depicting quadruped walking than modern artists. And then their subtitle is Erroneous Walking Illustrations in the Fine Arts. Now, notice they called it the Fine Arts from prehistory, so from cavemen era in their mindset, in their evolutionary timetable to today. And in fact, those cave drawings really are fine arts. And it wasn't until we had modern photography in the late 1880s that artists were able to get really accurate pictures of how the legs move with one another in the cycle of a quadruped stride, like a galloping horse or something like that. So do have a look at that study. It's in our fact file. And this was their conclusion. Cavemen were more keenly aware of the slower motion of their prey animals and illustrated quadruped walking more precisely than later artists. So there's nothing stupid or primitive about cavemen. They were extremely sophisticated. And in the professional literature and professional science, people recognize that. But we still have the popular picture of Ugg the caveman who's a brutish idiot. All right, let's move on to Neanderthals. They get a lot of publicity, and there's been a lot of research into them over the last few years as well. And it's proving very, very interesting. Now, this is the one of the casts that we have, and he certainly looks like he's pretty battered and had a long, hard life. And that's certainly true, but that he has had a long, hard life. But there's nothing primitive about it. The term Neanderthal actually refers to a place. It doesn't mean primitive, even though it's come to mean that in modern parlance. It's a place in Europe, in Germany actually, and it refers to the Neander Valley. Now, the Neander Valley was named after this man, Joachim Neander, who was a Bible-believing Christian, and he wrote some wonderful hymns, and he was a poet, and he used to walk in this valley, and so it became named after him. And one of the hymns he wrote was actually about creation. So he certainly believed that the Lord God created everything, including human beings. And so if we go back to our rather battered looking Neanderthal skull, yes, it is a rather odd shape. The cranium, the upper part of it, looks a bit different to a modern human skull. And this is the sort of early reconstruction that you would get from when they originally found these, and we're going back into the 19th century. And so he was usually portrayed as this rather brutish looking idiot, all bent over. Now, part of the reason for that was when they found some of the original bones, they were badly affected by bone pathology, by bone diseases, arthritis, and possibly rickets from a poor diet. And some of these bones were given to, or casts of them were given to this man, Rudolf Virchow, who was really the founder of modern pathology. That's the modern scientific study of disease. And he looked at them and he declared Neanderthal man to be a pathological specimen. In other words, a disease specimen perhaps of relatively recent origin. Now, he lived around about the same time as Charles Darwin, but he didn't believe in evolution. So he believed that these bones were just ordinary bones of people, but people who had suffered from a long, hard life and from bone diseases. Now, more bones of these were found. They've been found all over Europe. And in 1912, there was an almost whole skeleton found in a place in France. And again, they reconstructed it with a sort of upright but slightly bent over, slightly bent appearance. And so you would get these comparisons here, like in this old illustration, skeletons of Neanderthal man and Homo sapiens, as if they were different species. And for a long time, they were classified as different species. Now, the skeleton, the bent over skeleton, that is just biomechanically impossible in the long term. That just will not work at all. Human beings are designed to stand upright without having to contract our muscles. Our bones are neatly balanced again against the line of gravity that goes through our spine, through the hip joint and the knee joint, and literally holds them up straight by gravity and ligaments alone, with hardly any muscle movement at all. But that bent over thing, with even that small bend in the hips and the knees, and the forward bending of the head there compared with the pelvis, that's just biomechanically completely unstable. It just would not work at all. But anyway, they have done more research on these. Now, these days we can take scans of fossil bones, and we can reconstruct them together to see how they would function. So they've done this with these Neanderthal bones, and a recent study, again, which we have published the details of in our fact file, this scientist from the University of Zurich said, well, on the whole, there is hardly any evidence that would point to Neanderthals having fundamentally different anatomy. In other words, their anatomy is our anatomy. You just have to take into account that, yes, they did suffer from bone diseases, but so do we. And so now, at least in the museums, they have Neanderthal man standing fully upright. And this is from that display in the British Natural History Museum. However, they still haven't got it right, because notice he's not wearing any clothes. And I'm only showing the top half because the bottom half is also unclothed. And that is not right in terms of what we now know about Neanderthals. Right. This same scientist who did that study on the spine said it is therefore time to move beyond making Neanderthals less human and focus on subtle shifts in late Pleistocene human biology. Now, again, that's part of the evolutionary timetable, that term late Pleistocene. But what he's saying, we have to look at Neanderthals from the point of view of being human beings, and we can learn from their behavior in the time that they lived, however you like to classify it. So we'll let them look at that. All right, we've got lots of studies on their biology and on their behavior. Now, we can't look at them behaving. We can't go back into history any more than we can go and look at the Romans behaving and things like that. We have to take the evidence that we have got and reconstruct it. Well, we can do that with Neanderthals. And there's interesting research. This is just a couple of things. Their jaws functioned like modern human jaws. So there's no reason why they couldn't eat and speak and do all of the other things that we do with our jaws. But really interestingly is that their hands were capable of what's called a precision grip. So they can scan in all of the hand bones, put them together and see how they would work. And sure enough, their hands were capable of that very precise grip that you need for manipulating tools and for writing and drawing. And they have found some of their tools and they're smart. And that's That's their term. The scientists who study these things, right? And Neanderthals were also considered to be the first artists. Now, again, they're putting things into an evolutionary timetable, but they have looked at the cave art that's in caves where Neanderthal bones have been found. And again, we wrote up this study in our fact file and sent it out in our newsletter, so you can look that up. They were intelligent, skilled hunters because there's evidence that they were able to hunt mammoths. Now, you can't just go out and do that on your own. And mammoths lived in cold weather, so you can't go out without any clothes on, like the man in the British Museum, and go hunting a mammoth. You have to be intelligent and skilled and work together and communicate. So again, we have a picture of intelligent, sophisticated people who work together and live in community and to achieve certain important results. And they were able, so you put all of that together, and this is a more modern picture of them in a European museum. Notice they have actually got some clothes on him, and he's manipulating some tools with the animal that he has caught for both food and for making clothes, for making furs. Now, another interesting thing is that the research in their living spaces showed that they used fire, they cooked food, including grains, vegetables, and herbs. So they ate their greens. They didn't just live on the mammoths that they hunted. Their living spaces were organized into sleeping places and cooking places. And very interestingly, they have extracted DNA from some of these bones, and they've found genes that also exist. Now, that's not it's gene variants that are found in living human beings. And one of them is particularly interesting. Notice the color of the eyes that they've given this model, right? They're blue. They've found the blue-eyed gene, and there's evidence that some of them had fair skin and red hair. Same sort of variation that we have in modern human beings. Right. So in the end, right, Neanderthals are us. And this was a quote from one of the numerous studies that's been done on Neanderthals. To be Neanderthal is a distinct way of being human. By understanding Neanderthals, we enlarge the meaning of humanity. In other words, Neanderthals are part of the human race, the human species, and there's nothing different about them. And as Joseph said, they are now in the professional literature, they are classified as being fully human, as being the same as us. But people still have this idea that somehow they are primitive and human beings are evolving upwards. And they still think of, well, we're getting better and cleverer. Well, if you read the news these days, there's not much evidence for that. But this is an interesting point that was made by Steve Jones quite a while ago when he was interviewed about the whole issue, is human evolution over? Because he once stated, well, we've come to the end of human evolution. And he was asked this question by the interviewer, who started off by saying, well, I think there's some evidence that we already have bigger brains than we used to have. Again, notice the assumption. We used to be chimpanzees. Now we're not. So the interviewer went on, not at least when you look at chimpanzees, is that not a direction, that in the future we will have bigger brains still? So is that what we've got to look forward to? Bigger brains. We're not like those primitive human beings who lived in caves. Well, as we've said, living in a cave is not so stupid, and there are evidence in the cave shows how sophisticated they were. All right, well, let's put that to the test. And Steve Jones was quite honest about this. To be frank with you, I don't think so. The odd thing is we certainly have bigger brains than chimpanzees. Now, that's very true. In fact, we have more than 3 times the size of brain of chimpanzee. But we have smaller brains than Neanderthals. Now, remember the Neanderthal skull is certainly looks a bit different to this modern human skull. So let's do a bit of a brain size test. Now, these days we can scan living brains and we can actually work out very precise volume. But you can't do that with a skull that doesn't have a brain in it. But we can get an idea of how big the possible brain was by looking at the space inside. And so you can measure the volume or the cranial capacity. That's how much space there is for the brain to fit in. And if you do that for a present day human, you get an average of sort of around 1,350. Now, there's a bit of a range there of a couple of hundred mils on either side. So let's go to the Neanderthal skull. And again, it does look like it's a bit battered and misshapen, but it's certainly not smaller. It has a capacity that's another 100 mils larger. So Steve Jones was right. Neanderthal does have a bigger brain than the modern human average. And so if we convert that to sort of a volume of water, we've got that illustrated there next to it. Now, the original caveman is actually even bigger than that, around 1,600 mils. So instead of evolving bigger brains, as the BBC interviewer was hoping, sadly, we are undergoing a brain drain. And we're not evolving upwards. And in fact, this is how we should think of cavemen, Neanderthal men, those who lived under difficult conditions in the past. This is how they should be portrayed, and this is how they are portrayed in a modern German museum. Now, notice the properly constructed clothes, complete with little decorations there. Notice him crafting a wooden object using that precision grip that you need to be able to hold and manipulate a tool. These were intelligent, sophisticated people who did live a tough life under difficult circumstances, but they were fully human and probably smarter than us, because I don't know that I could survive in the conditions that they lived in, but these people certainly did. And if we could just end the slideshow now, there, Joseph, and come back to us. Human beings have changed, but we are definitely not evolving.
Diane, I'll throw in a comment before we throw it open to questions. That model of the human being, the white one, the Neanderthal with the staff, I took that picture in the Neander Valley Museum, and it reminds me of two things. Even the German area where he was originally found is acknowledging he was human, he was bigger than us brain-wise, he was very skilled and had no trouble behaving as a certified human being, and definitely a white one with blue eyes in some cases. But it struck me as I was going through in the Neander Valley in Germany that the history of the name itself is also fascinating, because Neanderthal, the Tal bit means valley, as in dale as in English, or vale. Right? So Neanderthal, Neander's Valley, is named after a famous hymn writer, Joachim Neander, whose most famous hymn is still in most church hymn books: praise to the Lord, the Almighty, the King of creation. So the name itself, Neanderthal, is probably, even though they chose it for a Darwinian reason, it actually points back to man being made in God's image. And even after the flood, they were still better, stronger, smarter, and bigger than us. So good points there.